Yes, absolutely. So I started in canine behavior when I was a psychology student. I went to Illinois State University, and all of my ABA classes were through the canine behavior lab. So the local animal shelter would drop off the dogs for class, and then we would learn about ABA by training the shelter dogs. So it was kind of a symbiotic relationship. We as the students get to learn about operant conditioning and respondent conditioning by training the dogs, and the dogs get to access some training to help increase their adoption rates. So this is really where my research experience really started, because there was always research going on in the canine behavior lab, and I got to take part in all of it, and I eventually got more and more and more involved. I got to train service dogs, I got to do scent detection training, I got to train deaf dogs and blind dogs and deaf and blind dogs. It was around this time that imitation in canine behavior was showing some really interesting new research. So we would be doing replications in the lab, and I even got to do one feline behavior study, which was on body language in cats. We also got to learn about other canine species like wolves and foxes, and I even had like a puppy development class. It was so much fun. However, my biggest area of interest was with the shelter dogs. There was one dog in particular who came in, and he actually had a pretty serious traumatic history. He had been in the shelter for about 2 years, and he was only 2.5 years old. His name was Pepper, and he was the first functional behavior assessment, or FBA, that I did on my own. I worked on behavior rehabilitation strategies with him, which eventually led to my very first independent research study that I did on behavior rehabilitation for shelter dogs who had experienced trauma. So I would go out to the animal shelter like almost every day working on my research, and I started bonding very, very closely with Pepper. So after the conclusion of my study, I ended up adopting him. Now, I really, really wanted to keep going in canine behavior. So Pep and I moved out to Arizona, where I got my master's in ABA from Arizona State University. Now, I chose ASU because Dr. Clive Wynn works at ASU, and he's kind of a big deal in the canine behavior world. If you know, you know. So Dr. Wynn helped me with my master's thesis, which I did on response-independent pairing to analyze the impact on adoption rates for the shelter dogs. And it was such a fun study. I loved that one. However, it was during my fieldwork experience that I learned you can only accrue hours with humans. So this is when I pivoted into the autism side of the field, and I became an RBT. And once I got my master's, I started doing more and more studies with humans. My first year as a BCBA, I was in the school setting, and my mentor and my friend and I did a research study on the AIM curriculum by Dixon and Palalunas and the impact that it had on student performance for particularly students with autism.